I think we could be in an actual wartime era. The facts say that the number of conflicts in the past 5 years has risen substantially. So I think if you're the leader of a country and you see this international landscape, I think a relatively rational decision would be to build up your military and be more tough.
But I think the issues that we have to address as a global citizenry are still there. Food insecurity is still a big issue. There are humanitarian crises across the world, especially in parts of Africa. Climate change is still a big problem, and I think there has to be creative ways to really address them.
The question is how to make it sustainable and to keep things going and not necessarily be as beholden to a single or few financial sources.
Peace is indeed an attainable goal. Peace is possible and feasible.
A lot of time when we focus on an international level, we forget the actual people that face things on a day-to-day. We need to engage more local as opposed to having a top-down approach.
Efficiency still plays a great role, but you're very much right that it's not just efficiency. The main trend that I see or what this leads to in the marketplace is consolidation.
Then the next thing I think, which is very interesting, given the structure of the world order, I think BRICS will play a very important role because it has the potential to really step in and kind of tilt the multi-polar world order.
What might be more important, I believe, is efficacy. That is, are we actually achieving the right things? And efficiency comes after that. The impact of AGI will look like on the human society of any number of years from now is extremely conditional on
giving this lack of trust between local citizens and big multilateral organizations. Do you see the UN still as a viable mechanism to promote peace?
The narrative gets set at the macro level, but changes actually happen at the micro level.
I think it's important to remember that the European Union was really founded as a peace project, right? And it's actually been immensely successful in achieving that.
With the advance of generative AI right now, do you see that we will be able to think for ourselves, or will we have those type of leaders in the future that will be able to, on the spot, think about a big issue and make the right decision? Greetings, Asha, Arvind, Reuben, Tim, and Nicolas. Welcome to Meeting the Moment.
Thank you very
Hey,
much.
Esnold, how's it going?
Thank you, Esnold.
Sure. Thank you for making this happen. Really appreciate it. For this first episode, very special, and I'm glad to be surrounded by very special people as well. So we'll begin like this. For our listeners and viewers, can you please tell me a little bit about yourself? Like, who are you? What is your engagement in this world? And what is your contribution to this conversation? I'll start with Arvind.
Hello all, nice to meet you. My name is Arvind. Currently, I'm a research scientist with an organization called NORC at the University of Chicago. I am a quantitative social scientist by training, and I'm passionate about helping young people, empowering young people build a robust identity for themselves. And I try to do much of my work to inform policy making in those contexts with quantitative research to the extent possible. And in today's conversation, I would like to share what I know about child and youth development, and I'm looking forward to learning more from all of you. Thank you, Esnold.
Okay, my name is Asha Richards, and thank you for having me, Esnold. I am a girl of many hats, so I work as an administrative associate at the Mayor's Migration Council. I also serve as chair and Northeast USA representative of the Global Jamaica Diaspora Youth Council, and I also serve as a United Nations International Organization on Migration Youth Changemaker for 2024 into 2025. And I am an international development practitioner by training. And what I hope to bring to this conversation is one, kind of framing the international relations, international governance landscape at the moment, as well as the importance of diaspora engagement and relations.
Awesome. Reuben.
Thank you, Esnold. My name is Reuben. I am an international development practitioner, really interested in agroecology, food systems, and food security, among other interest areas. In terms of what I'll bring to this discussion today, it will be really advancing the debates and conversation around development aid and Africa's role in the global world order. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim?
Yes, thank you very much, Esnold. I'm Tim. I'm originally from Hamburg, but now I live in Berlin, Germany. I work at the intersection of business and politics, a field that's always interested me very much. More specifically, I work for a project, a government-funded project in Germany called the Import Promotion Desk that focuses on helping small to medium-sized enterprises from developing countries or emerging economies to basically sell more of their products and services to Europe. And I think this perspective is also mostly what I can bring to this conversation right here. This perspective of trade and development cooperation and how that works or how that affects small growers or small to medium enterprises who try to compete in this marketplace while also really just trying to make lives better for themselves and the communities that surround.
Awesome. And then Nicolas.
Hey, Esnold. First of all, thank you for inviting us, and you called us special, but I think you are special for making this podcast happen. So again, I am Nicolas de Albuena. I'm from Bogota, Colombia, and first of all, I'm a carer of a 12-year-old Shiba Inu called Dante. That's my main profession. But I am a conflict analyst with the Latin American Institute of Peace from 9 to 5. And so we analyze and produce recommendations on conflicts throughout the region in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I hope to bring some perspective on a region that is sometimes overlooked, but as a proud Latin American, I think deserves more attention. I think we have also things to say about global governance and the challenges we all face.
Awesome. So let's begin like this. What is the state of the world in your field, in your respective field? What are 1, 2 trends that are currently going on in the sector?
So I think in our case, for that from the perspective of a conflict analyst, I think we could be in an actual wartime era. The facts say that the number of conflicts in the past 5 years has risen substantially, especially when we consider that 10 years ago we're living in the most peaceful era in human history. There were less interstate and interstate conflicts than any time before. But today we're seeing the terrible Russian aggressions in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, that although we have the ceasefire, we're still a long ways from peace, and the terrible civil war in Sudan that's created the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet. And I mean, to not go too far, we have a very complex crisis in Haiti that is the most pressing humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere. So I think if you're a leader of a country and you see this international landscape, I think a relatively rational decision would be to build up your military and be more tough, so to say.
Awesome. Tim, what are the 1, 2 trends in your sector right now?
Yes, like I said earlier, working kind of at the intersection of trade and also development cooperation, similar to what Nicolas has said, there's just been changes in recent years, right? I think we've come from an area, even when I was growing up still, well, there was always talk where you would say, okay, trade is a good thing, and you want to grow trade. It creates win-win situations. It creates something that's good for everyone, and it's something that we should pursue. Also, as a Western country like Germany, there was a general agreement that also international development cooperation is good, and working together with emerging economies in that sense is a good thing. That's something that doesn't just help these economies, but it also helps your own country and can also create win-win situations in that sense. And that's just a notion that we increasingly see challenged over these last few years. And it seems like there's not this general agreement anymore that these are inherently positive things. Generally speaking, I do believe there's benefit to what you can do in these sectors. I do also think that there's an opportunity here to critically look at the things that might have not worked so well in the past, right? There's been a lot of criticism, especially about development cooperation, and well, some of that criticism is really probably overblown because it also just reads well in the media. Also, there's also some merit to some of these things, right? Because you have been working from that notion of not really looking at these things so critically, but just seeing them as a good thing. And I think really taking a long, hard look at what trade can create in terms of win-win situations and what also development cooperation can create in win-win situations could also lead to these sectors coming out of very challenging times, like at the moment, quite a bit stronger, having found that rationale for themselves again.
Cool. Reuben?
All right, thank you, Esnold. The current state, I think it's very obvious to a lot of us, and I think Tim and Nicholas have already echoed some of it. But I think when you look at the current state of the international development field right now, I think the main issue is that of aid and how it's been cut and how donor countries are cutting back, reprioritizing where funding goes, and in some cases defense and more national strategic interest. But I think the issues that we have to address as a global citizenry are still there. Food insecurity is still a big issue. There are humanitarian crises across the world, especially in parts of Africa. Climate change is still a big problem. So there are a lot of things that are happening. So I think on one hand, yes, aid has been cut, but the problems are still there. And I think there has to be creative ways to really address them. I think it might provide an opening for new actors to step in and help, and also more local efforts and local solutions, and things of that sort.
Awesome. Awesome.
Okay. I really think that my colleagues have hit the nail on the head. So I'll try not to duplicate what they've said. But I feel like we are in a turning point when it comes to development and global governance, with countries turning inward and a lot of funding, core funding, that goes to a lot of the traditional areas for development and aid being pulled. We're at a bit of a pivotal point where we, as, young professionals, but also the traditional entities, get a chance to really look at their structures and see how best they can pivot from this. And granted, there have been calls for change and calls for a restructuring for a very long time. But I think that this has now propelled these institutions to really take a look at it and also have more flexibility to do so, considering that they aren't necessarily as monetarily or financially beholden to certain entities. Coming from a migration standpoint, as my colleague said, the funding is gone, but the issues are still there. In fact, they're a bit more rampant in a lot of areas. With that said, it is very heartening to see that work is still being done and there's a lot of interest that is still there. While they might not be as overt as they used to be, the work is still moving and there's a lot of support that is still out there. The question is how to make it sustainable and to keep things going and not necessarily be as beholden to a single or few financial sources. So if someone or a country or a donor decides to back out, that whole sector doesn't fall apart.
Awesome. Thank you. Arvind?
Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed everyone's summary. The way I think about the state of the world when it comes to child and youth development is a perspective. So for me, child and youth development, and particularly it has three key points. The first is it's upstream. An identity of a young person is how they see themselves and how they see themselves in relationship to the world in which they live in. This can be the natural world, the cultural world, the social world, the economic world, everything, right? The second part is it's multidimensional, which is that an identity is a composite of your personal life, your career, your friends, the social norms and cultural values you carry within yourself, and how you identify with others, given how you identify yourself and people that feel like you, look like you, talk like you, think like you. And finally, it's multi-level. That is, an identity of a young person is influenced by their own thinking, experiences, that of their friends, family, community, region, culture, country, everything. So everything that you guys spoke about touches upon the things that I care about one way or the other, right? The conflict, the business, the investments in the international scene, the reallocation of resources and priorities, employment opportunities for young people. So the state of the world right now is that there are very fast paced structural shocks to the typical ecosystem or pattern in which young people build this identity for themselves. And we have not thought about this issue enough, given how upstream this is. It affects everything that you guys just spoke about. These young people become adults, and these adults then end up making decisions on all the topics that you guys spoke about. So for me, giving the right kind of support in such a fast paced world that is structurally changing from a historic perspective, right? Like, we thought internet was disruptive, but AI has been disruptive at a very different level. We thought social media was disruptive in terms of mental health of young people and how they see themselves, etc. But again, AI driven social media has taken that to a whole new level. So, the state of the world for young people right now is that they are experiencing changes in their environment and ecosystem at a rate in which we are not aware of and not supporting them enough. And I think that could have significant consequences in a couple of decades or even sooner. And I feel that there is a need for this kind of a multidisciplinary, multi-perspective forums and communities to come together and understand what's the best way to support young people, or more in terms of how engaging young people early on in your respective topics of interest and research can help in building a safer world down the line.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Indeed, it is a busy world out there and a lot of things are changing. Nicolas, in that section, I would like to start with you. You work, your work focuses on peace building and security. And as you said at the beginning, we are seeing that countries are building up their military capacities at a breakneck speed, the major economies mostly. So at this time, like given the current situation, for professionals like you, peace builders, is there a future for you in this world? Or in other words, is peace still possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I hope there is, because if not, I'm going to be unemployed forever. No, I'm just kidding. I just want to say that peace is indeed an attainable goal. We used to say at USAP that peace is possible. Peace possible and feasible. I mean, just a decade ago, we were living in the most peaceful era in human history. Just think about it. We are living in an era, and like in the hundreds of thousands of years of human history, we lived in an era in which people are coming out of poverty by millions every day. Mainly in India, mainly in China, but here in Latin America, I mean, for the past 20 years, the Colombian economy has risen 250%. The Bolivian and the Peruvian economy grew 400%. So, for instance, a person in Bolivia today is 4 times richer than they were 20 years ago. They have more opportunities, have more ambitions, if you want to say that. And so, also today, people are victims of violence. As Arvind was saying, we have technological advances that are making our lives even better one day after the other. And that's the way the world is moving. But I think that's what peace looks like, right? It looks like advancement, it looks like progress. And that's why it is not only attainable, but even necessary peace to tackle the most pressing challenges of our generation, which I think are artificial intelligence and climate change. So that's to say, yes, peace is possible, and we're making it happen. But how do we make it possible? And so I think there's an arc of peace and peace building. And the first part of the peace is prevention, right? So you identify the dynamics and variables that could lead to conflict in an early stage. So we can intervene and diffuse those crises so that they never happen in the end, which is difficult because how do you say that something never happened, you know? But to do so, we need a strong and capable of and wide-ranging network of people in the field and analysts and even spies to continuously gather data and keep track of the trend. So organizations such as ACLED, Crisis Group, this type of work. So that's early warning and prevention. But then the work of diffusing this crisis or negotiating the end of current conflicts is a completely different task. So that's where the organizations such as the United Nations or the Organization of American States come into place. So they analyze the causes of the conflict, the structure of incentives for each of the parties in the conflict. So, one thing can be inequality in a society, but another thing could be the interest of every single warring party. And then they carefully design dialogue and negotiation processes to find an arrangement that works for each of these parties and channels their energies away from war towards peace and development. And so for the case of Haiti, for instance, it's CARICOM, right? The Eminent Persons Group. They negotiate these kind of things. And finally, you may have a peace agreement, right? You have a ceasefire, but then you have to actually build the peace. You have to actually address the root cause of the conflict so it doesn't happen again in a few years' time. So as I was saying, things as inequality, racism, corruption, xenophobia, they don't get addressed in a peace agreement. You have to create the conditions for them to be structurally resolved. And so development and peace builders work structurally to address these challenges. I say this because these parties often take it for granted by the news society in general. When they sign the peace agreement, everybody's happy, and then they forget that they have a lot of work to do. And that happened to us here in Colombia. We signed one of the most sophisticated peace agreements in history, human history. Peace agreement in Colombia from 2016 is 250 pages. It's as long or even longer than a constitution. But then the challenge of actually bringing peace and development to the territories that were most affected by the war remains a challenge even 10 years from back then, right? And now, from that challenge, we're seeing the resurgence of violence and conflict in those very same places. And so in USIP and now in ELAPS, the Latin American Institute of Peace, we have strategic contribution to every single part of this peace building arc. So for instance, in Bolivia in 2024, we published analysis on their brewing political crisis, ringing the alarm bell that something could happen there. And we published that piece in July 2024. Just a week later, the military tried to depose the president of Bolivia, right? And we also provided key technical memos to the negotiating parties in Venezuela. Now that Maria Corina Machado, she was just announced as the Nobel Peace Prize winner this morning, I think. They were negotiating in terms of free and fair elections with Maduro last year. We contributed to that negotiation. That one failed. And now in ELABS, we're currently trying to work out in terms of peace building in the future. We're working with some groups of civil society, Esnold, to start thinking what do we need to do in the short and medium term to foster a stronger and more resilient Haiti, right? So it doesn't goes back to the cyclical nature of their crisis, but now we're done with this one and we're going to build a stronger Haiti for tomorrow. So that's basically the arc of peace building in a 101, so to say.
Awesome. Asha, I know, based on what we just said, like our world is facing like significant pressure. Also feels like the progress that we have made over the past 80 years since the end of the World War II, really, both economically and institutionally, is diminishing, at best being questioned. At the same time, there is still a lot of issues, problems that can only be tackled as a collective. Some of these problems could include migration, security, or climate change. Based on your observation, what is the kind of like immediate or long-term future of collective global governance?
Okay, so the short-term future, well, clearly there's a lot that has been changing. So in the short term, there will definitely be some time of adaptation, which I think we're currently in the middle of. As we've seen, there's a lot that's been going on in the world, and there's been a lot of doubt in the international institutions on what they can actually do. What can they actually broker? However, I remain positive that the international space will remain strong. However, to do so, while there is the global governance and global coming together, we also need to look more locally and also be more inclusive in the voices that we actually engage. Perhaps, not perhaps, having stronger partnerships with local entities or even local governments. For example, I work with the Mayors Migration Council, which is a coalition of mayors around the world that bring advocacy and also subgranting to city governments to support migrant projects that support migrants. And this kind of work is important because a lot of time when we focus on a national and international level, we forget the actual people that face things on a day-to-day, the entities that actually need to provide basic services to people on a regular basis. And their lack of inclusion in these conversations kind of make a lot of what is discussed not as effective and efficient as they need to be to address the problems that everybody faces throughout the world, whether that be climate change, whether that be issues with migration and status, whether that be poverty. We need to engage more local actors. And with the changing atmosphere and many of the larger entities larger funders such as the United States, and just really a lot of countries are turning inward, there is a void, an opening, and it kind of leaves a vacuum for international entities to, okay, if we can't depend on our traditional funders and traditional entities to kind of guide where we're going, how about we look more locally as opposed to having a top-down approach, us meeting as a global group and then going into countries and saying, okay, this is what we need to do based on what we've discussed, actually involve the local governments, but not just the local governments, the local people. Actually engage them, find ways to have these discussions. I mean, we live in an age of technology, and we found with a lot of funding being cut, instead of having the same type of version of conferences that we'd have, especially in, which typically end up happening in the global north, but you have these sessions virtually that opens up a wide window of who can actually participate in these conversations. And then having these local stakeholders not only gets you an accurate picture of what's happening on the ground, but it actually engages the stakeholders that can more efficiently and more directly make a change. So in the short term, it's going to be an adaptation because it's been decades that we've been working in this particular way. It's going to be a shift. Granted, the pulling out of certain countries in regards to the amount of support that they've given has really caused the shakeup to really look within. But in the long term, I think more meaningful and engaging partnerships and more engagement of local and impacted communities is the way forward for international governance.
Tim, you work at the intersection of trade and international development. In the past, efficiency was the driver of trade. But now it's more about security. It's about securing supply chains, risk reductions, and everything without neglecting the geopolitical concerns. How do you see, or what is your observation about the possible unintended effects of trade reductions? For example, fewer opportunities for mid or small economies, reductions of people's living standards and all of that. So what is your observations about some unintended impacts of trade or the current environment? Not really the current, but the trend in global trade.
Yeah, thank you very much, Esnold. That's a very good question because I think it's very complex and there's different ways to look at it. I think
give me
actually
a young professional perspective.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. I think I would like to reframe
Okay.
and push back a little bit on how you asked it, because I do think it's still very much about efficiency, especially in today's market as well. Because, trade has gotten under so much scrutiny, comparatively speaking, and, and people look at it a lot harder to see whether it makes sense. Efficiency still plays a great role. But you're very much right that it's not just efficiency. That's why I think this question is so great. Besides just looking at efficiency, how you've done in the past, now resilience and risk reduction play a very big role, right? To also achieve that efficiency that buyers or actors in this space want. And I think the main trend that I see, or what this leads to in the marketplace, is consolidation. And that's the one thing that I would like to talk about here as well, because that's something that I also see in my work. I'm going to use the flower sector as an example because I work with companies that export flowers or try to export flowers to Europe. I actually have very nice carnations from Colombia next to me, Nicolas, that I've seen last week right here. But this is just one example from one sector. But for example, there used to be at Frankfurt Airport, there used to be 40 or 50 German wholesalers that imported flowers through the Frankfurt Airport and then distributed those throughout all of Germany. Germany is by far the biggest market for imported flowers in Europe. Today, there's only one wholesaler remaining who still does shipments through Frankfurt. Instead, what everyone does is everyone goes through the Netherlands because economies of scale are just a lot better. There's better infrastructure, there's bigger players, all the logistics companies are there. So almost everyone that imports flowers to Germany on a bigger scale has collectively decided, like many other actors in Europe or even the world, that going through the Netherlands is the way to go because it's not just the most efficient, but it's really also the most resilient way and the way that reduces the most risk and ensures that your product gets where it needs to be at a bigger time. And like I said, I'm doing this for the flower industry right now, but this rings true across so many industries. I feel like it becomes increasingly hard for smaller to medium enterprises to compete in a space like that because that advantage of bigger players in the industry just really gets bigger in challenging times like this, because you just have so many things to deal with in a world that's very turbulent, right? You have problems with shipments, flights might not take off. You have the European Union that's very big on regulating certain things and asking for certificates, whether that's on sustainability or other things. And it's very, very difficult to comply with all these things, and becomes more and more harder for smaller companies to fulfill these things, which just really leads to a lot of consolidation. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because of market theory that I think we all know about, right? Especially when we talk about local governments and locality in general, like you did, Asha, earlier. If you really want to create wealth and reduce poverty locally, it's very, very important to not just have very big players that are creating jobs and lifting people out of poverty, but especially all these smaller family type businesses, because that's just more sustainable. Because a big company can go into a different or a part of the world and, build up a factory or something and create thousands of jobs. But a big player or a big multinational like that can also take thousands of jobs away just like that by making a business decision that probably makes sense for them and is not that big of a deal to them, but has a huge impact on a local community. Well, a group of small or 20, for example, smaller style family-owned enterprises are not going to operate like that. And that's why it's so important to have that mix. And that's why I think consolidation in that sense is a very big risk that I think needs to be taken very seriously, and is also something where you just need to be careful to not create unintended monopolies, because that's not, I think, where the focus is right now in this discussion, but that's something that still has very real and direct consequences on people's everyday lives in different parts of the world, whether that's Europe or Germany or emerging economies somewhere else.
Very interesting. Reuben, globalization has brought significant benefits to this world, to humanity. At the same time, it has also left many people behind, like people and nations behind. This is not something that was not that was not known by scholars at the time or policymakers at the time. The consensus was that it's like the benefits would outweigh the cost, and that from that benefit, leaders, policymakers, and the ones that benefited the most would do some sort of like redistribution and help the ones that were left behind to kind of like move forward. This is partly done through like aid, development assistance, and all of that. But given the current situation in like international development right now, how do you see or how do you view the future relationships between developed and like less developed or underdeveloped countries?
Thank you for that question. It's pretty loaded, but I'll give it a good shot. First, I think we start by acknowledging the fact that the current development aid sector is in transition. It's being reoriented in ways that we haven't seen, and globally, that is, with different donors and different actors stepping back and reprioritizing where funding will go, and looking more so towards security, like it has been mentioned previously on this discussion, and defense, and looking forward to the militarization of some sort. So there is that aspect. So we're looking at that domestic side of things. But then on the receiving end, with recipient governments, it's also a wake-up call, right? It's a wake-up call. It is a situation where countries have to now go back to the drawing board and figure out ways in which they can really fill that gap. So with all the changes that are happening currently, it's evolving, and we will only know the impacts of this in a long time. We see some of the effects at the moment, I'd say the short term or to the medium, but then long-term effects are yet to be seen. So there are those aspects. However, I think there's some things we should consider first. One, where we're witnessing a reprioritization and streamlining of official development assistance in areas of strategic and national interest from the donor side. You have European countries stepping back, increasing, moving budget pieces towards NATO or other defense areas, and you have other countries specifically doing the same thing. So there is that aspect there. So what that might look like in the future is, even where there's still aid flowing from the advanced economies, it will probably look like investments. It will probably look like aid coming for security infrastructure. It would look like trade, like has been mentioned here. So that's kind of one angle in which that relationship might unfold. The second is we'll see the rise of gap fillers in the sense that private foundations, they are not entirely excluded from the picture. They exist and have existed, but I think this is an opportunity for private foundations to step up and to be able to fill that gap, especially in areas like healthcare, as we see with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That's already an ongoing program of that nature. So you have private companies are going to step up. And when I say private companies and private foundations, these are not necessarily just from the donor countries. These are also from the recipient countries. So you have private foundations coming up and stepping up from these countries. So that whole local ownership that Asha talked about earlier would be very pivotal here. Then the next thing I think, which is very interesting, given the structure of the world order, I think BRICS is really, and when I say BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that structure will play a very important role because it has the potential to really step in and kind of tilt the multi polar world order that we keep talking about. Like, how would that look like? So you have that configuration also stepping in and saying we can actually play an advanced role with the utilization of their development bank from that entity. But then again, I think when the next area we would look at is state actors. I think we cannot forget the role of China in the current development space, and I think China will most likely promote South cooperation, which has already been happening, but I think we will see more of that. And the debates about China are mixed as well, because some are saying that China might not necessarily step up or even fill the gap, which is well debatable. But I think we will see China's involvement. This is an opportunity for it strategically to position itself in areas that it thinks there's a gap and it needs to step in. So I think there's that aspect. But also, besides China, we're looking at also Gulf countries. Gulf countries are also looking at how they can leverage their foreign policy tools, and development aid is certainly a tool that they can utilize to ensure that they can access. And we're talking about other parts of the world. So I think there are some of these areas. But I think overall, what's key here is that for recipient countries, it is more so about looking at self-reliance. I think when I mentioned there was an opportunity and also a wake-up call, countries will have to sit back and say, well, we have to look at other ways to really get funding. So domestic resource mobilization, other creative ways to really bring funding in, sovereign wealth funds and what have you, in order to be able to tackle some of the challenges that we're facing currently in that part of the world. So I think in all sense, presidents and leaders of countries in the developing world or emerging economies will be sitting and thinking, how can we really address this issue? What should we really prioritize to ensure that we can address some of these areas where funding has been cut? And, we're talking of areas like health. Health is a big issue. We're talking about food security. How do you address these areas? And then obviously the humanitarian side of things, which is also big. So I think the relationship is not entirely dead, but it has been shifted in a way that would require actors, state and non-state actors from both sides of the advanced and emerging economies, to really look at what is of priority to them. So on one hand, you have advanced economies saying, if we're going to really continue aid, we'll have to reprioritize in a way that makes it work for us, in a way that aligns with our interests. And then recipient countries also have to look at it from a perspective of what can we do to fill that gap and not really depend on it, because as we see, it could be a tool, it could be a leverage, depending on who's giving and who's receiving. So I think overall, the relationship will kind of evolve in that way, and we're still seeing the evolution of it. So that is kind of my take on it. Thank you.
Great. Arvind, everything we've discussed so far is happening against the backdrop of another revolution, which is AI. AI is set to transform every aspect of human lives, from decision making to economic growth to winning wars. So it will not be limited to one or a few sectors. There are statistics about AI's impact in terms of like the number of jobs that will get lost, its economic impacts, like by how many percentage it will grow the global economy and everything. But the one that I would like to discuss here is that many AI developers or kind of like AI researchers believe that by between 2030 and 2050, we will have what we call, or what they call, artificial general intelligence. If all these predictions come true, what will humanity look like after 2050?
Wow, you really know how to throw a curveball. So, I mean, AI has such a broad and deep impact across all factors of life that honestly, the impact we see from AI today was not anticipated a couple of years ago. And I'm really not sure what AI is going to look like a few years from now, or what even AGI will look like when it happens, and what might be its impact. But for me, what this level of disruption offers is an opportunity to really think deeply about what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be humans in a society. Now, what I mean by that is one of the big challenges in narratives when it comes to child and youth development space where I work on is it takes a lot of language from like the market theory or the economic theory. We still keep talking about like efficiency in achieving certain outcomes, like how do we make it most efficient for children to complete school or to go to college or to get a job. And AI has an impact on all of these things one way or the other. So a lot of the conversations happen around that space. But rather than efficiency, what truly matters for a child and youth growing to become an individual in a society, and I think even for adults going forward, what might be more important, I believe, is efficacy. That is, are we actually achieving the right things? And efficiency comes after that in terms of like, are we getting it done? Are we getting the right things done in the right way? But we often skip the question of are we doing the right things in the first place? And to me, AGI is not a threat. That way, I really feel like this was meant to happen, right? If apes and chimpanzees became humans as we are today, like information agents, intelligence agents that are able to process complex phenomena happening around us, it was only a question of time when we were able to make it happen outside our physical bodies. And the more important question is, are we preparing the global order, the global social order, more importantly, to be resilient to shocks that can come from AGI on an expected basis? Like AGI is not a unexpected phenomena anymore. You know it's gonna happen and you know it's coming fast. So the answer to your question on what the impact of AGI will look like on the human society of any number of years from now is extremely conditional on how we build our local systems, how we strengthen our local communities, how do we integrate local markets with global trade networks. And I completely agree with what everybody said. The narrative gets set at the macro level, but changes actually happen at the micro level. And we need to be much more cognizant of that gap and bridge it to make sure that AGI serves everyone in a positive way. If not, we will probably see a lot more of inequality. We are going to see a lot more of communities, countries, societies that are able to leverage the benefits of AI or AGI become better, more efficient, and richer. But that also means there's going to be a backlash on what's going to happen to everybody else. And think about what it takes to make that AGI happen, right? Data centers getting constructed all over the world, the amount of water resources that gets consumed, the amount of farmland potentially that might get taken over to construct data centers and related infrastructure going forward. Like, what are we actually doing in pursuit of AGI that's disrupting how we function as a species? So I think for me, that's what it will come down to. Like what AGI's impact will look like in 20 years from now, 30 years from now is going to be based on, are we ready to absorb that level of disruption and channelize it in a positive way? Then maybe there is a scenario where everyone grows well together in an equitable fashion. If not, we will probably see more and more of conflicts arising because of inequality and disruptions to trade and global peace order, because the kind of incentive change at the systemic level that AI is capable of making happen within a year is immense. It will take one significant breakthrough of a AGI technology in a military powered country to change the global power order. So I think it's going to be a question of how we frame this problem and how we think about the solution set to the set of problems that comes around this narrative.
I don't know if anyone has the answer. We'll have to see, right? Actually, I'm gonna ask that question to both Asha and Reuben. With domestic issues sort of defining every aspect of the international landscape nowadays, also because of the globalization or unfulfilled promises of globalizations, local people and other actors, they sort of channel the anger that is left or that is caused by those unfulfilled promises. They geared them toward multinational organizations like the UN, EU, I guess to the AU as well. So now that those organizations are facing more challenges than they have faced before, how do you see or what do you think leaders at those organizations need to do to stay relevant, but also to regain the trust of citizens across the globe?
I can start with that. So I think what you have here is a balancing act then, because on one hand, and just looking at leaders heading multinationals, it's about on one hand balancing where money is coming from and where it's supposed to go to. So basically you're caught up in the middle and you don't really have much of a say because you're at the mercy of donor governments. So there's that angle to it. And on the other hand, with recipient governments, leaders have to kind of be also at the mercy of whoever is funding or whoever is providing aid. So it means what that means is having to restructure certain things, having to change agendas, national agendas to suit whoever is funding that. But from the countries that are actually developed countries that are actually funding, providing aid, I think they're also going through a lot because citizens are demanding and asking a lot of questions about where money is moving and why is it that certain issues are not being addressed domestically and why. So, to an individual who doesn't understand the development landscape, you need answers from your government why it's taking money, millions and if not billions of dollars, moving it to another place where it deems it necessary when you think there are poor people, there are people who need those resources in the country. So I think overall, the way I see that is a balancing act that really requires a lot of strategic and intentional partnerships and also negotiations that will really change critical aspects about how a country that is receiving aid will have to adjust. I think that's how I see that.
Awesome. I guess communications
Yeah,
as well.
piggybacking on
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, piggybacking on what Reuben said, I think the big question is, and the big problem from recipient countries is there's an entity outside of our country that is making decisions in theory on our behalf, but the everyday person does not see the effects of those decisions or might not necessarily agree with those decisions or don't feel like their voice is heard in those decisions. Therefore, from a larger country, a more developed country standpoint, why are we funding this if it's not benefiting us? And then from a lesser developed country, why should we put our faith in these organizations when we can't see the benefit in our day-to-day lives? And as Ruben said, and as I alluded to earlier, there needs to be much more strategic partnerships, particularly at a local level, particularly in the lesser developed countries, I believe. And also just re-looking at who are the true actors in the development space. As I mentioned, I serve as chair of the Global Jamaica Diaspora Youth Council, and one thing that I have always advocated for is looking at diaspora, and obviously not as the only stakeholder, but as a valid stakeholder. Oftentimes we look at development as this organization is doing this, this international organization is doing this, but sometimes development comes from everyday people. There are a lot of people that channel money from the global north to the global south on a regular basis. Taking Jamaica, for example, remittances account for nearly 25% of GDP. While that is different for many different countries, but why do we not look at that as well as aid? It's all about framing. and realizing that there are much more actors in this space than the actors that we typically relied on for decades. And as I was saying, as they're pulling away now, it's kind of forcing not just international organizations, but local governments to really look at the different stakeholders that are in the space and not necessarily what is traditional. So that means when you're thinking of experts in a certain field, not necessarily just, the Harvard graduate or the Oxford graduate, how about also engaging and making sure that they are at an equal level, someone that has lived that experience, because we have to equal lived experience to educational experience. I always say this all the time. When I went to Ghana, oftentimes you hear when you're talking about malaria prevention, sending mosquito nets. But if you actually sleep under one, it is hot, extremely hot. And that's something that you won't know unless you've actually been there and know that. So it takes the collaboration of not just outside knowledge, but local knowledge and those that actually feel it and know what's going on to really come together to make those solutions. The fact that there even is a Global Jamaica Diaspora Youth Council and a Global Jamaica Diaspora Council shows that at least the Jamaican government, but I also know there are many governments around the world that are looking to engage our diaspora. They're specifically looking for not just knowledge transfer, but investment to support and bolster their country's development. So I say diaspora just because that's my background, but there are plenty of other stakeholders that are out in the world that aren't necessarily in the traditional mindset of development and aid, but they're out there and they're doing work. How can we engage them more meaningfully? Because oftentimes they're working, but it's at a very small scale. If we have larger partnerships and are actually working as a cohesive unit, the magnitude and the effort that they're doing can be put at scale. And you would have more efficient and more effective service delivery, as well as actual change, tangible and visible change in the everyday person's life. By engaging all of the stakeholders that are in the space, you can actually make that impact and restore trust in the organizations.
Awesome. Nicolas, just a little bit of the same question, touching on security, peace building. An organization like the UN, they play a pivotal role in peace building. Given the current state of things internationally, do you see them playing even a bigger role in peace building? Do you see the UN still as a viable mechanism to promote peace?
Yeah, well, I see that you brought the easy questions today, Esnold, but at least it's not the one that Arvind had of thinking of the humanity in the future. But I think, and this one is really related to what Reuben said before, and Asha you have touched on that as well, and that there's a trend towards regionalization and sort of the end of globalization, right? I went to undergrad to study international relations in the early 2010s. And back then, so that was 15 years ago. So back then, the trend in international relations studies was that the primacy of the states was coming to an end, right? And so international organizations were ending, NGOs were taking over, people were actually becoming actors themselves. But what we're seeing today is that the states are never going to wait, right? The states are going to be the primary actor in the international system, and we have to deal with it. But it's not like the past 20 years never happened, right? I think there's a growing trend towards regionalization. And there's a really good piece from Brookings Institution talking about this in relation to the normalization of the use of violence at the international level. So, for the case of Latin America, we don't have much interstate wars and we value our regional organizations very deeply. So the Organization of American States is really important in the relations within Latin American states. What the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights says, it's almost as law for Latin American countries and Latin American societies. And so I could see how the United Nations keeps being relevant to organize these regional blocks, but then to resolve these very regional, these very local challenges, I could see regional organizations stepping in, right? And I also like your idea, Asha, of also thinking about people themselves as developments of engines of development and engines of peace, right? For the case of Haiti, the Haitian diaspora in the resolution of the Haitian crisis is super important, right? they bring not only knowledge, but they bring resources, they bring energy to resolve a crisis that has happened for the past 5 years. And I know throughout the Caribbean, I mean, Asha, you know better than me, for the case of Jamaica, diaspora is very important in actually bringing some perspectives that sometimes we in the home countries we're looking at ourselves instead of just trying to bring a different position. So I think that from one point you can see a growing trend towards regionalization. On the other part, I think it's important to understand the gravity of climate change and how we're going to deal with that as as a global commons. So, for instance, in the case of Latin America and as a bloc only represents 10% of the global carbon emissions. But we'll still suffer from some of the most acute effects of climate change. So we have terrible hurricanes in the Caribbean. We have historic droughts and massive wildfires. Disaster countries. So, for instance, the wildfires last year in Bolivia were the size of Portugal. In the wildfires here in Colombia, I mean, I was looking outside of my window and I will see the mountains of Bogota on fire, which is something that I've never seen before. So all of these effects could radically destabilize our societies. Throughout the Caribbean, I mean, Asha, you know better than me, for the case of Jamaica, diaspora is very important in actually bringing some perspectives that sometimes we in the home countries we're looking at ourselves instead of just trying to bring a different position. So I think that from one point you can see a growing trend towards regionalization. On the other part, I think it's important to understand the gravity of climate change and how we're going to deal with that as as a global commons. So, for instance, in the case of Latin America and as a bloc only represents 10% of the global carbon emissions. But we'll still suffer from some of the most acute effects of climate change. So we have terrible hurricanes in the Caribbean. We have historic droughts and massive wildfires. Disaster countries. So, for instance, the wildfires last year in Bolivia were the size of Portugal. And in the wildfires here in Colombia, I mean, I was looking outside of my window and I will see the mountains of Bogota on fire, which is something that I've never seen before. And so, on the one hand, you have the retreat of the U.S. You can see the change from a partner in human rights and democracy to a more of a Monroe Doctrine, hard power, and transactional actor. And in this case, I do believe China will and already is filling that space in Latin America, from my experience. I think they are building key infrastructure in the region. They're aiming to become a global champion in the fight against climate change. And so our region, the Latin American region, could see itself divided between these four imposed opposite blocks. But I do think for our case, and that's related to what you said, Asha, as thinking about international politics as also what people drive these politics, right? I think there's an inherently Latin American factor, and also that happens in the Caribbean as well, that there's an identity of Latin American, right? There's the identity of a Caribbean citizen. And so I think as Latin Americans or maybe as Southeast Asians or Europeans, how do we resolve our common problems together and how we present ourselves as a bloc at the international system to kind of mitigate the effects of AGI, climate change, and great power competition.
Um, Reuben, in every continent, birth rates are declining, populations are aging, and also natural resources are diminishing. This is the contrary in Africa. Africa has an abundance of all of these. The continent has over 1.5 billion people, about 70% of them are under 30. Like, this is a very young population. It also ranks like top 2 or top 3 in terms of like reserves for natural resources, and holds roughly like 60% of the world uncultivated, still arable lands. What I mean by that is that the continent has a lot of resources or that are essential for the next phase of the global economy. I should also mention they have very important choke points in terms of global commerce. So with all these resources, with all these opportunities, is the continent prepared to take advantage of those opportunities? Especially, what can leaders do to ensure that the global actors approach the continent as a partner and not as a problem to solve?
Right. Thank you, Esnold. I think when we talk about the future of Africa regarding demographics and also resources, it's quite an interesting topic of discussion. So I will address it on twofold. One, in terms of the demographics and all the resources. I think, like you mentioned, it's one of the youngest continents, and the future is incredibly bright for the African continent. But with that comes a lot of responsibilities. So I think one thing we have to consider is the demographic dividend. So what I'm saying is the ratio of working age people to the ratio of the dependency population. I think that is something that African governments have to really look at, because currently it is not at the point where it needs to be for the continent to really experience that economic growth that it needs to. And that's something. But the other aspect when it comes to demographics is brain drain. So we talk about a very young continent, but we also have a continent where a lot of young people need resources, where a lot of young people need opportunities. The talent is immense, but how do you translate that into meaningful economic growth? And where the opportunities are lacking, young people are moving to advanced economies. So you have a lot of young professionals. We're talking about nurses, doctors who are moving away, and then that's creating a gap on the continent for sectors like the health industry, the health sector. But what's interesting about that is you have a lot of government, whereas the investments in education are not where they ought to be, but whatever is already invested in the education sector on these young people that you're hoping will stay and develop the continent ends up not materializing, because then they get to a point where they're not able to further their careers or further receive further opportunities, then they move away. So you have that gap, which I think is a problem when we talk about the demographics in Africa and young people. So I think governments need to really focus on that. Shifting gears to the resources that you talked about, it's also a continent that has an abundance of resources that are critical. We're talking about AI and all these other technologies. A lot of the resources from the continent are critical and pivotal to the artificial intelligence revolution we're seeing and all these other advancements. But how is the continent benefiting from it? So basically, I think we need to reimagine how Africa and the world engages with the extractive industries on the continent, because what you're seeing is it has this colonial machinery to it that hasn't changed much, extracting from the African continent and moving it to other places, in this case is advanced economies or more emerging economies, where it is being moved from just a raw material to a finished product. So Africa is losing out on that. So I think there has to be a way that that is addressed, in a way that the value addition is kept on the continent, or there's a more intentional and beneficial approach to that. But with that also comes another problem, right? So you have this idea of capital flight and illicit financial flows, which is a big problem for the African continent, because a lot of capital is leaving. A lot of taxes are not being paid by firms involved in these extractive industries. And this, one could tie this to corruption and other elements. So I think there has to be a reimagining of the extractive industry in Africa, whereby African governments are able to get that resource, get the financial benefit of these resources. But with that also, I think moving on to the next point is economic diversification. The continent has all these resources, but I think it also needs to look at other sectors. I think culture is a big thing, and we did talk about the diaspora. When we talk about culture and tourism combined and music to that, I mean, Africa right now, we talk about Afro beats, and everyone is listening to some sort of music that is tied to that. How can we leverage that to ensure that it works for the continent to really so we're moving away from just like talking about Africa's resources to other areas and other things that Africa can really, really leverage. And that's where the diaspora comes in. There are a lot of Africans who are in the diaspora with a lot of skill set that are willing and ready to go back on the continent and help fill the gap in the areas that the continent struggles in. But there are areas that are lacking, that are not allowing people to go back, because the infrastructure is lacking, the red tape, bureaucracy, and just other inefficiencies that are not allowing the diaspora to go back. It's not worth their time. They're not necessarily after the money, because a lot of the people from the diaspora are just ready to go back and work. But it's just these issues. But quickly, also, the future of Africa, I mean, there are lots of regulations, there are lots of policies. For instance, the African Union has Agenda 2063. It is incredibly comprehensive and really talks about the Africa we really want. And it factors a lot of different thematic areas, on how Africa would be a global powerhouse by 2063. But what that means is that implementation could be a problem, or how is that being implemented? How is the continent pushing to ensure that Africa is moving towards becoming a powerhouse? So I think that is there. So the continent is actively thinking about that. And regional integration was also mentioned earlier. The regional integration is big. How are the regional economic communities collaborating to ensure that Africa is able to advance its goals? What can the leaders do? Well, I think one, the leaders should really stop mortgaging Africa's future for short-term gains. I think that is something that African leaders should be more aware and realize that the younger generation can benefit from the continent's resources, but we don't have to mortgage the future for just short-term gains that are not even advancing our priorities. Issues such as like electrification and power are still a problem. Movement of people. The continent has a lot of policies about, regional integration, but it is incredibly difficult to move from one African country to another by flight. That we need to work on how to integrate that continent to make it more united. That way you have a lot of young people traveling to other parts and experiencing what Africa looks like, because it is probably easier to fly out of the continent than within the continent. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed. And then, like I mentioned, we need to involve the diaspora a whole lot. So to summarize, basically, Africa has the population, it has the talent and all of that, but how do you ensure that that is retained in a meaningful way for an African to say, I am willing to stay and work in the continent because I am able to advance my career and future goals, right? That's one. But also when it comes to the resources, how can Africa ensure that the resources work for Africa so we don't end up in a situation where the resource curse continues to just be a problem as it has always been, to ensure that Africa is not just sending resources for the new and emerging technology, but Africa is actually part of that. So I will stop at that, but it is an interesting discussion that has so many parts to it.
I hope to continue that conversation with you. Arvind, one of the things that I really like doing is to read or listen to past leaders, and especially when they are talking about how they dealt with an issue, like talking to another state leader about solving a big problem or on a hot topic. They always mention how it is important for them to have that mental fortitude, to have the ability to go back in history and at the same time look maybe like 50 years into the future. That means they need the ability to think. With the advance of generative AI right now, that is sort of like thinking for us. Do you see that we will be able to think for ourselves, or will we have those type of leaders in the future that will be able to on the spot think about a big issue and make the right decision?
I think so. I think at the end of the day, as long as there is a functional human society, there are going to be problems that need solutions for which AGI can be a good tool or a barrier. But either way, at some level, we will need leaders who are decisive, who can understand the situation as it presents itself, understand the obstacles and the various strengths that resources and people bring together, and then make the right call for themselves and the society going forward. It's like how we learn to adapt thinking once we had internet and Google. I think there'll be like an interesting adaptation of how we process information and then use it for decision making, and maybe it will happen very fast, and maybe we are not sure how that might look like. But at the end of the day, like, leaders still are leading people who are suffering in one way or the other, right? Fundamentally, humans are compassionate animals. Even if wars are happening, people are fighting, or whatever it is, we are still concerned about the other people hurting. A child not feeling well, being fed, old age person being abandoned and feeling lonely in their society. And all of this is the motivation why we come together and try to figure out common solutions. So I think as long as we have a society in which there are people suffering in one way or the other on one hand, and then there are compassionate leaders on the other hand who want to solve these issues at large for the society, there will be need for decision making. And then as a consequence of that, there will be need for decision making skills. It's only a question of how that skill might change, but the fundamental necessity for it, I don't think is ever going to go away.
Thank you. And then really last one, Tim, there is a familiar cliche that America invents, China scales, and then Europe regulates. And in many aspects, like in AI, green tech and stuff like that, Europe is seen as lagging behind. From your vantage point, how do you see Europe in the coming years?
Yeah, thank you, Esnold. Also, a good question. Hard to answer, I think, because it can go either way, right? I think it's important to remember that the European Union was really founded as a peace project, right? Going back to peace building, and it's actually been immensely successful if you look at the history of the continent in achieving that, which also, in my mind, still, no matter how you think about all these problems that the EU might or might not have, think makes the EU a very successful and also kind of essential project for the continent that I think would pose very, very drastic risks if you were risking pulling that apart, which a lot of leaders are doing right now. On the other hand, it's of course valid to think as of the EU as kind of slow in terms of how it operates, right? I mean, no one thinks of the EU as something that's super agile and that's very startup friendly compared to a place like the US or China. In very real terms, it's comparatively difficult to find agile companies in the European market space that then create wealth from that position. So I think what the EU needs to do in order to also be successful in the future is to keep reminding itself of its original purpose, because that's very, very important, especially in the world that seems to be destabilizing as it is at the moment, while then also trying to take a more pragmatic look at how it operates. And that's obviously very complicated, but I think in a sense the EU there faces some of the same problems that, for example, the United Nations face at the moment, seen as ineffective, just a lot of bureaucrats or people getting together to talk without really getting anything done. And I think the EU just needs to find a way to not just exist in the bodies that it has right now for the purpose of existing and trying to be self-sustainable or self-serving in that way, to see a challenging moment like this as a moment for a sensible restructuring of its bodies to become more effective, to funnel activities and efforts like that in the right direction.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As young professionals in working in a field that is dominated by more established players, what challenges have you faced in terms of like asserting your voices in global forum? This is a way like really for me to look forward as young leaders. What is the challenge that we're facing, and how do we move forward?
I think one of the challenges that young professionals face in these fields that we've talked about are just the rigid structures that we're dealing with in these spaces. I've seen that from different angles in Germany, and especially coming in as a young, optimistic person that's also trying to look at things from a very idealistic point of view. I found it hard at times to find an angle on how to work with these structures, how to think about ways to maybe improve how things are done, and also try to change the world for the better a little bit. It's very easy, I think, to be disillusionized after starting to work in that field, especially since the sector is under so much duress.
Awesome. Asha?
I think we are stepping in the right direction. The fact that a lot of the entities, at least that I've engaged with, are actually interested in hearing youth voices is a very good step in the right direction. However, there is a lot left to be done. Oftentimes, when they seek out youth voices, it's often in a very, I don't want to say like performative, but they'll have a youth forum specifically, they'll have a youth event. But when the actual decision making is happening, the actual meetings that, I don't want to say the youth events don't count, but the meetings that actually count, where are the young people in those meetings? Being able to bring young people to those meetings is very important. Also, recognizing that, young people, we are young professionals. Oftentimes, for the type of advocacy and roles that they're seeking, it's almost always volunteered. At the beginning, as I said, I wear many hats. And while the hats are hats that I love, the ones that I love the most are often the ones that are not paid. And when you're trying to, run an organization that has no funding, but also you're not getting any kind of stipend, and then you're trying to do this and do that and do that, volunteer while you're also working full time, it takes a huge toll, and it's very difficult for you to actually sit down and focus on the matter at hand because you're being pulled in so many different directions.
Yeah.
So actually making youth leadership sustainable for the young person is extremely important. And also with that, recognizing that when you have all of these roles as volunteer, there's a certain type of young person that you will receive. There are youth from lesser developed countries that have the same knowledge, that are brilliant, but just don't have the capacity or the bandwidth or the means to be able to do these volunteer positions. And there's a whole lot of youth that are missing from those conversations.
Yeah. Nicholas?
Yeah, I think you stated it perfectly, Asha. But I think there's another challenge, and it within ourselves. I think this idea of the imposter syndrome is super difficult because you may have the opportunities, but then you limit yourself. And to that, I will say, speak up. Nobody is gonna know that you have these amazing ideas or these amazing talents if you don't show them, right? It's not like people have X-rays and they can see through your mind. So I see your book there in your library, Esnold. You have the book of Why Nation Building Matters from Keith Mines, and I consider him one of my most important professional mentors. And so when you speak up and you take the chance to, throw yourself to the water, you may find some champion, some mentor that is going to help you, guide you through this process of here's how the bureaucracy works, and here's how you can make change happen. So go out there, as we say in Spanish, quémate, burn yourself. Nothing's gonna happen. It's only gonna hurt for a while, but then you're gonna be a better person afterwards.
Thank you. Reuben?
Right. I think everyone has summed it up really well, to be honest. But I think one area that I just would quickly touch on is a lot of young professionals who go into the field are really passionate about social change and oftentimes get really frustrated by the structures that Tim was referring to earlier. So I think to what Nicholas and Asha were talking about is I think as a young professional, you just really have to find your voice and go after the things that you're really passionate about, even if you don't find it in the places where you're working. There is an opportunity for you to be a change maker. And it could be in the form of a startup, it could be in the form of advocacy. But I think there's a lot of opportunities in the midst of the barriers. So I think just simply pursuing that thing that you're really interested in, like Nicholas was talking about. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. I don't think there would be a better way to end this. So, Asha, Reuben, Arvind, Tim, and Nicholas, thank you very much for this special conversation. And I really look forward to staying in touch and following your work. And I hope that every one of you will also stay connected with each other, at least on LinkedIn, and then continue this good work forward. I can say I'll see you at the top in the next 5-10 years.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esnold.
Thank you, Esnold.
That was great.
Thank you so much.